Good morning and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to welcome you from all over the world to the lecture series of the Center for Theory in Historical Research at the Department of History at Bielefeld University. We especially warmly welcome our guest Dipesh Chakrabarty. We are very happy to have you here. And we also welcome the guests from Bielefeld University, Eleonora Rohland, Angelika Epple, Matthias Albert, and Zoltán Simon. My name is Britta Hochkirchen and I am one of the board members of the Center of Theory for Theoretical Research at Bielefeld University. Our center is organizing several lectures each semester. We invite international scholars with the aim to discuss their theoretical approach together with scholars of the Department of History and beyond. That is why we are very happy about this kind of conversation, which will take place this evening with Dipesh Chakrabarty. It was Zoltán Simon, research fellow at the Department of History, who had the idea to invite Dipesh Chakrabarty and to organize this conversation with scholars from different disciplinary fields at Bielefeld University to discuss Dipesh Chakrabarty's recent book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. We will record this conversation for our YouTube channel, but only the first part, the conversation between our guests, and not the open discussion in the end. We are looking forward to this discussion. Thank you very much, Zoltán, for the organization. Thank you to our guests. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Britta, for the quick introduction, and hello everyone. I'm Zoltán Boldizsár and I will moderate today's event, which, as Britta said, was prompted by the publication of The Climate of History in a Planetary Age by the University of Chicago Press just a few months ago. And in the book, Dipesh Chakrabarty synthesizes his by now more than decade-long engagement with or in making sense of the Anthropocene predicament. Well, the idea of this event is to enter a conversation with Dipesh about the central themes of the book and about the overall agenda that it sets for the human and social sciences. Well, it's an incredible honor to have Dipesh with us today. Very many thanks for coming, and his conversation partners will be from the Bielefeld side, Eleonora, Rohland, Angelika, Epple, and Matthias Albert. And before we begin the conversation, let me briefly introduce the participants, even if, because of the time pressure, highlighting only a few achievements in far larger bodies of work. So, to start with, of course, Dipesh Chakrabarty. Dipesh Chakrabarty is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, and the College at the University of Chicago. He ended up with history with a PhD from Austrian National University in an unconventional life course and the study track of twists and turns after earning degrees in physics and in management in Calcutta. As of 2021, he is the recipient by now of many honors and awards, including in 2014, the Toynbee Prize in Global History, which in the phrasing of the Toynbee Prize Foundation was established to recognize social scientists for significant academic and public contribution to humanity. In 2019, he was also the recipient of the Tagore Memorial Prize of the government of West Bengal for his book, The Crisis of Civilization, Explorations in Global and Planetary Histories, published in 2018. Dipesh Chakrabarty is a founding editor of Postcolonial Studies, and with Sheldon Pollock and Sanjay Subramaniam, the founding editor of the South Asia Across the Discipline series, run by a consortium of three university presses, Chicago, Columbia, and California. He's a founding member of the editorial collective of Subaltern Studies, and his 2000 book, Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, published with Princeton University Press, alongside his 2002 book, Habitations of Modernity, Essays in the Wake of Subaltern Studies, published with the University of Chicago Press, are instant classics across the human and social sciences. An encounter with the Anthropocene could not have possibly posed a greater challenge than the realization that the intellectual labor of a whole lifetime, as Dipeshs put it in 2009, had not really prepared him for making sense of such a planetary conjuncture. And taking up this challenge, again, as he put it in 2009, of exploring how to relate to a universal history of life while retaining what is obvious value in the post-colonial suspicion of the universal, led him to a decade-long engagement, and I hope you don't mind the expression, a conceptual struggle with making sense of the Anthropocene, which is what we are going to discuss today. And to highlight a few milestones on the route that led to the climate of history in the Planetary Age, I'd like to mention the 2009 article in Critical Inquiry, The Climate of History 4 Thesis, an eye-opener to many. Then the 2015 Tanner Lectures in Human Values, which he delivered at Yale University, and the 2017 History and Theory lecture at Harvard that came out in the journal in the following year with the title Anthropocene Time. And just like the 2009 article, it now forms a chapter of the book that will be the basis of today's conversation. On the Bielefeld side, we have Eleonora Rohland. She's a professor for entangled history in the Americas, working at the intersection of entangled histories, environmental history, and disaster history. Her latest book, Entangled History and Environment, Socio-Environmental Transformations in the Caribbean, 1492 to 1800, came out with the University of New Orleans Press in 2021. It is addressing an Anthropocene prehistory by attempting to understand the parallel transformation of societies and natural environments amid the complexities of colonial early modern entanglements. Eleonora's former books are Changes in the Air, Hurricanes in New Orleans from 1718 to the present, published with Bergan in 2019, and Sharing the Risk, Fire, Climate, and Disaster with Carnegie, published in 2011. Eleonora is a co-founder of the lecture series Lectures for Future Bielefeld, devoted to a transdisciplinary discussion on the multiple Anthropocene crisis, and she's the co-editor with Olaf Kaldmeier, Anne Tittor, and Daniel Hawkins of the Routledge Handbook to the Political Economy and Governance of the Americas, which came out in 2020. Most recently, with Angelika Epple, Antje Flüchter, and Kirsten Kramer, she co-edited the volume Contact, Conquest, and Colonization, How Practices of Comparing Shaped Empires and Colonialism Around the World, which came out with Routledge this year. The volume showcases the work of the Collaborative Research Center, Sonderforschungsbereich in German, SFW in short. So it showcases the work of the SFW Practices of Comparing, Ordering, and Changing the World, which has commenced its second funding period just a couple of months ago, funded by the German Research Foundation. And Angelika Epple, our next participant from the Bielefeld side, was the spokesperson of the project in the first funding phase, and she's currently one of its deputy speakers. She's also Vice Rector for International Affairs and Diversity at Bielefeld University and full professor of history with particular focus on the history of 19th and 20th centuries. Her research spans through multiple scales, from microhistory to global history, and multiple interests, from historical theory to gender studies and the history of racism. To complement the volume mentioned earlier, I'd like to pick a few highlights from her publications, starting with the recent SFW volume she co-edited with Walter Erhard and Johannes Grave, Practices of Comparing Towards a New Understanding of Fundamental Human Practice, with Bielefeld University Press last year. Then I'd like to highlight an earlier, a pre-SFW co-edited volume with Angelika Schelzer, Gendering Historiography Beyond National Canons, which came out with Campus Verlag in 2009. Then her book on the company Stolberg, which exemplifies her project on the microhistory of globalization, which came out in Germany in 2010 with Campus, Das Unternehmen Stolberg, eine Mikrogeschichte der Globalisierung. Finally, I want to highlight Angelika's 2018 article in History and Theory, calling for a practice turn in global history, practices as drivers of globalizations. Finally, our third participant on the Bielefeld side is Matthias Albert, Moore Professor of Political Science, speaker and PI of the research training group World Politics, the Emergence of Political Arenas and Modes of Observation in World Society, also funded by the German Research Foundation. Mathias works with a system theory approach and the historical sociology perspective, attempting to understand most recently social evolution in world politics, alongside which he also works on the politics of the polar regions. Again, I'd like to single out only a few highlights, starting with two of his recent co-edited volumes. Both appeared this year, very fresh. One is co-edited with Tobias Veron, What in the World? Understanding Global Change, by Bristol University Press, and one co-edited with Sandra Holt-Greve and Carson Preuss, Envisioning the World and Making the Global, with transcript. Next, I would like to highlight his book, A Theory of World Politics, with Cambridge University Press in 2016, which is also the foundation of the research training group World Politics. Finally, just to mention an article to exemplify his research on the polar regions, I'd like to highlight a piece in Geographische Zeitschrift in 2015, The Polar Regions in the System of World Politics, Social Differentiation and Securitization. So I expect that all these diverse research strands, which all have multiple ties to the Anthropocene predicament, will be reflected in the coming conversation. And as to the format, Dipeshs will begin with a circa 10 minutes input, followed by the reflections of Eleonora, Angelika, and Mathias. In about 5-7 minutes, each of them will put two themes, questions, or points to the table, providing the focal points for the exchange. And finally, we hope to reserve some time for opening the floor to questions from the audience. So without further ado, which is a very odd expression because I was just talking 10 minutes. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dipeshs.
Thank you very much, Zoltán, for inviting me to this forum, and I'm extremely honored to have been invited and honored to have three distinguished colleagues to discuss my book with. So as I was explaining to you all before we went public, this book was different from all the other books that I've written in the sense that there was really no model for it. I fell into this problem. And I fell into this problem because two things, but autobiographically, because of my love of the outdoors in Australia. And the outdoors were getting very badly burned by wildfires. In the decade of 2000, when first decade of this century, when Australia was going through a very bad drought. And in 2003, all the nature spots I loved were burnt down. And my friends were telling me, this is not an ordinary drought, this is climate change. And I had heard the expression global warming, but I had not bothered to read anything about it. I was completely reading the literature on globalization, and then realized that actually the literature on globalization, public writing on globalization, and global warming date back to the same period. They begin from the 1990s, that actually begin to get popular books on both subjects. But I fell into it also because intellectually, because of my peculiar academic background and my own confusions, intellectual confusions in life. I always had an interest in the physical world, in understanding the physical world. Unlike many of my friends in history or literature, and for a long time in high school or even in college, I did not know whether I wanted to pursue my interest in the physical world or whether I wanted to pursue my interest in the social world. And my interests in the social world were political. So I was a kind of 60s Maoist, a failed one, in my undergraduate years. And it's really the failure to become a Maoist revolutionary that got me into business school in self-disgust. And then in my business school, I discovered a Marxist professor, and I discovered Marxist history writing. Because I had not done history before, in school, we were streamed when we reached year 9. The government required us to tell the system whether you wanted to do science or whether you wanted to do humanities. So discovering Marxist history was an eye-opener, and it's thanks to my professor in the business school that he initiated me into history, and eventually I did my PhD in labor history. But in the training in history, there were always model books. It was like I never felt that I had no model. So I started out with labor history and business history, which is what you could do in a business school. And of course, there was the great work of E.P. Thompson, to argue with, to think about, and then even the German debate on everyday history, Alf Ludke, and that debate it got translated, came into our lives. So there were models. There were all models of debates that people already had. And even labor history debate went back to long sort of tradition of debate on class consciousness, agency, and Lukács and Jörg Lukács, and all of those things you could read up on. Whereas encountering climate change and realizing that deep history, geological history, planetary history was becoming a matter of interest for me as a humanist historian. And once I realized that I can't separate the story of globalization, of race, of class, of gender, sexuality, and all those differences from the overall impact that the human project, human flourishing, the extension of the human realm to the 20th century to now was having on the planet. Once I realized these two things could not be distinguished, I realized that I was interested in global warming, but I did not know how to think about what my social science, beyond what social science taught me to think about. And that's why I call it falling into deep history. So things that were matters of specialist interest. I mean, geologists always knew the geological history of the planet. Doctors always knew about your microbiome, that there are zillions of microbes in your body. A couple of Australian doctors got the Nobel Prize by showing that ulcers were caused by bacteria, not stress, in the late 20th century. So when the doctors treat you for ulcer, they don't treat you with a Lockean conception of who you are. They treat your body as a colony for microbes. And now you realize that most infections happen. The pandemic happens because we swim in an ocean of microbes around us. And reading this literature, also you become aware that the majority forms of life on the planet are microbial, and that the human form of life is a minority form of life. Whereas from the 20th century on, because of great acceleration, the increase in our numbers, technology, overall rise in standard of living, the modernization of China, if you think of the rise in the consuming classes. So it was 1985 when we had 1 billion people who were consumers. And we are now at 4. And the space at which, the speed at which we add another billion, that pace is increasing. So it's actually accelerating, in spite of there being 2 billion human beings without access to fresh water. So while there is inequality, and probably increasing inequality indices in many places, there's also the fact that there's been a huge expansion of consuming class and a certain change in their nature. So there's a Hoover Institution report showing that in 2000, the consuming classes were made up of, 70% were made up of people from the North, the global North, including Japan. And now 60–70% are people from China, India, and other emerging economies. So in many ways, if you did not have a problem like climate change or environmental problems, big environmental problems, you would have thought that we are living in the age that the Harvard psychologist Pinker writes about, that human society is increasingly becoming better and better and better, right? But in some ways, now you realize that, yes, we're becoming better, but there's a price, there's a bill that comes at the end of living it up. And so that's how I got interested. And initially I wrote up whatever, because in a way it was the shock of reading up on climate change and the shock of recognizing that there's something called the Earth system, that this is a planet in which geology and biology are connected processes. Once I realized that the Earth system is like a system, at least it's the application of systems theory, Matthias' point of interest, to the geological history of the Earth, which makes him now Earth systems history. Realizing that human beings have the capacity to interfere with some of these very large-scale planetary processes, but not necessarily the capacity as yet to fix them. I began to realize that to respond as a humanist to this situation, I need to read some Earth system science. I need to engage with Earth system science. And because of my background, see, I was not trained by science studies. In science studies, people have a lot of skepticism about science. If you read them, you'll think that science is primarily the politics of science. Whereas for me, these scientists were like fellow historians who worked with different methods, with different archives, with different rules of evidence. I was not a specialist, and I know that they debated among themselves just as we historians do. But I treated them as fellow historians in order to see how deep history and our short-term histories come together. But the writing the book has been a journey. So, as I wrote, I got criticisms. I agreed with some of the criticisms. I disagreed with some of the criticisms. Sometimes I thought people were not quite understanding what I was trying to say. So I tried to explain more what I was trying to say. So in a way, the book became a journey. And at the end of the journey, when I finished the book, I tried to, there were many things in the Tanner lectures, for instance, that I did not include in the book because my ideas had evolved. And, becoming an academic in our times, I've always felt, and particularly in neoliberal times where publications matter in a peculiar way, I've often felt, and this was before I started to work on this book, that things that Marx would have put in his Grundrisse, in his notebooks, are things that I'm publishing. So, or we all publish, because there are so many journals, there are so many friends who come and say, give a talk, do this, do that. And if you don't do those things, the institutions come to you and say, you haven't been productive. So I always feel that we don't have the privilege of writing a lot of stuff in our notebooks. Half-formed thoughts, the first shape of a thought. So in a way, what happens is the first shapes of our thoughts get published, unless it takes a super person to withdraw from those sorts of pressures and institutional invitations. So anyway, in a way, when I got to the book, I tried to write it up as one book. So I worked on every chapter except the one that got published in History and Theory, the History and Theory lecture, which I thought was more or less, it fitted into the narrative. The early mistakes I made, for instance, in the 2009 essay, was that I treated biological agency and geological agency as separate. And it's only later I realized how close biology and geology are on this planet, that these are processes you could not completely separate. The other change that came over is that the category planet became more important for me. Earlier on, I was working with other categories. I had kind of landed on the globe-planet distinction early on, but I hadn't developed it. And initially I thought the Anthropocene is the category I'm working with. And then I realized that if the geologists accept the label Anthropocene, as a geological epoch, name of this epoch we're going through, then Anthropocene as an epoch will probably outlast human beings. So the Anthropocene cannot be a periodizing device for human history. Whereas what I could see is that as the news of climate change was being discussed in the media, the planetary processes were coming more and more into everyday comprehension of people. So in a way, in many ways, the planet was emerging as a matter of humanist concern, everyday concern. So the idea of the Anthropocene, so for instance, we hear about renewable fuel and non-renewable fuel. And that talk essentially refers to the distinction between human time and planetary time, because as I say in the book, if you could wait around for a few 100 million years, the planet might again make fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are not inherently non-renewable on this planet. Similarly, we talk about sea levels rising. More importantly, we talk about the oceans becoming more acidic. And we talk about what impact that can have on planktons. People are becoming more aware that it's microbial creatures, small creatures, so-called inferior forms of life that keep supplying the air with fresh oxygen. So in some ways, I thought it's really these planetary processes that are becoming a matter of everyday concern. And in that sense, I felt that if you went back to the late 20th century and asked many people what they thought about, educated people, they would probably not mention these planetary processes. And my example of that is, of course, and I mentioned this in an essay I wrote for you, Zoltán, is the article that Charles Meyer from Harvard wrote in American Historical Review in the year 2000, saying, consigning the 20th century to history. And it mentions everything about the 20th century except climate change or global warming, not a word. And if an erudite historian didn't know about global warming, I wouldn't expect people to have known about global warming. But now people do, more people do. Everywhere. People are aware that the weather has become erratic. People are aware of flash floods, wildfires, heat waves happening now in Canada and on the western coast. Australians have learned at their own cost what global warming is. So actually, when you look at the last 20 years, last 12, 13 years, it's become more and more part of everyday consciousness. And that's why I said that we are at the cusp of the global and the planetary in terms of what we think about. So our everyday consciousness has changed. And therefore, I thought working with the category planet rather than Anthropocene as such was more important. And that was another turn. So I mentioned two turns. One is from not understanding that geology and biology were connected on this planet to understanding that life itself was a geological force. And to kind of take the scientific literature on the Anthropocene, but distill out of it a new category that I think was a humanist category, the planet, which I kind of arrange in opposition, somewhat in tension and opposition to the categories like globe, world, earth, and you had have a discussion of actually. So that, and the other interesting thing about the book, which I don't say it because the category planet is, the book is hugely indebted to my readings in German thought, in English mostly. And the category planet is a critique of German thought, in the sense that it's a critique of Heidegger. But at the same time, I owe the capacity to make the distinction between globe and the planet to a beautiful essay that Heidegger wrote on Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic. So I've tucked away that information in the footnote, because I was kind of, I didn't want to sort of dilute my stance of being critical of Heidegger by also acknowledging the debt I have to him. But, you are always in debt to people you criticize most deeply, right? So maybe so tell me if I'm at the end of my 10 minutes, then I'll just stop because there's a lot of things to discuss and I can always come back to things I have not mentioned.
Yes, thank you very much, Dipeshs. And then,
okay.
And then I think then let's start the exchange part. Eleonora.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks to Dipesh for sort of elucidating again the process, the thinking process of your book, and sort of adding all of these comments that you just gave now. This is very engaging, and I'll try to be very quick and brief with my 2 points, which of course were difficult to choose from such a wide-ranging collection of texts and intriguing thoughts. While reading your texts, I was kind of thinking with a split brain, trying to filter on the one level all of the explicit and implicit challenges of your chapters to the discipline of history itself. That is, to how we do history, to its evolution as a discipline over the last 100 years or so. And on the other level, I was trying to process the many thematic or more sort of history internal challenges or controversies you brought up. So my first point is about the disciplinary level. In chapter 5, Planetary Aspirations, Reading and Suicide in India, you write about how the political as conceived since the European Enlightenment is centered in the individual and the individual human body, and how this perspective is at odds with an Anthropocene thinking that out of necessity has to understand humans as a species that is entangled and deeply dependent on the life of other species. So a little bit what you just commented before about the microbiome understanding of human bodies. And towards the end of the chapter, you say that, I quote, "The thinkers of the political do not yet know how to construct the political on the basis of the understanding of the human body that several branches of science give us. That it is porous in its boundaries and remains a zone through which other forms of the living and the non-living necessarily traffic," end of quote. My question is, does the same not also apply to the humanities understanding of nature? And I put this in scare quotes, which still in many ways is a simplistic kind of 18th or 19th century nature understanding rather than the Earth system's biosphere understanding. And in other words, do we as political scientists and historians need to acquire these new biological or Earth system understandings of humans and nature to do meaningful future research in the Anthropocene? And if so, what might our research look like? That would be my first point. And the second point on the thematic level is more a remark and concerns chapter 4, the difficulty of being modern, where I was glad that you brought up the difficult and ambiguous point of the so-called third world countries wanting to catch up with Western modernity and its societal benefits. In my own region of study, the Americas and the Caribbean especially, colonialism has taken a different trajectory than the Indian case, but the ambiguity in becoming modern in the energy and development sense is very similar, I think. And it's a very conflictive field, especially with regard to green energy policy and global climate policy. So I'd like to hear maybe some of your thoughts on how to move forward on these very contentious and difficult political issues that we sort of stuck with, that are also a time question in our current situation between the global north and the global south. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Angelika, please.
So I'm really very grateful, Dipeshs, to meet you in person finally. So I really will take the opportunity to thank you, not only for the fascinating read of this book, but also, of course, for all the other works you've been shared with us and your thoughts. And I think maybe I'm not always convinced and I'm not always with you, but I think it's been one of the most important readings to me, not only this book, but also, of course, the Provincializing Europe, and not only the first chapter, but the whole book. I feel that more often than not, people only read the first chapter, but it's really a fascinating book, and thank you so much. I think Provincializing Europe has become a buzzword, and I would say the title of your latest book, The Climate of History, has the same potential. I have the feeling that maybe one of the main misunderstandings or in the reception of Provincializing Europe, at least in my view, was that many thought that you would deny the existence or the possibility of universal ideas. I did read it differently. I thought that you showed that the historicity of concepts leads us to the understanding that concepts always are grounded in local contexts, and so that universal ideas are located always, and that this local context inseparably changes the idea or the concept. So the local concept is like a spoonful of ink, so to say, in a glass of water. One drop of blue ink turns the glass of water blue. So that was how I understood your Provincializing Europe. So Provincializing Europe becomes a utopian endeavor in a way, and the endeavor is closely linked to the principles and context it seeks to overcome. And now I would like to quote Chakrabarty, quote, "The project of Provincializing Europe must realize within itself its own impossibility," end quote. So, and I'm quoting this because I feel that this is a pattern of argumentation that we can also find in the climate of history. However, I'm not sure whether or not you really would agree with all of what I'm saying right now of my reading. In my view, the climate of history is about decentering the human, of course, also of a new understanding of the political that would include more than only human actors. But I would like to add provocatively, also for the discussion, for the to really make the discussion work. It is also about recentering the planetary into the anthropocentric world of the human. In an answer to Bruno Latour, you're saying solar energy is trying to absorb the planetary into the global. My question would be, is your outline of the climate of history a plea for intensifying the project of the Enlightenment? So I would like to very briefly elaborate on this question a bit further. As to my reading, central to the climate of history is the distinction, you've mentioned that in your short introduction, the distinction between two concepts, the global and the planetary, and the planetary and the global. This distinction also includes the distinction between human one, as you call it, and human two. And both the global and the planetary are analytical concepts, and they allow us for a description of anthropocentric history on the one hand and deep history on the other. And you've just explained also the difference in the concepts between the anthropocentric and the planetary. The global is a humanocentric construction, as you say. It is the subject of global history, the way in which historians make sense of historical experience. Since the 18th century, the global is shaped by a specific Eurocentric, I would say, understanding of the relation between the human and the nature. And you take Fernand Braudel as a very impressive example, and he has powerfully shown that nature was perceived as the environment of human agency and history. So as part of the project of the Enlightenment, humans started to dominate nature. The planetary, in contrast, is the Earth system that decenters the human. It includes the living and the non-living. It's about deep time, a development, one could say, since the Big Bang. The human, in this planetary understanding, only appears as a species. This is the human two, as you call it. Interestingly enough, these two theoretical concepts, the planetary and the global, are in fact intertwined at various levels. one of which is the role of the human and the human agency or the human activity. I'll take that up a little later. The relation between the human and the nature, as the Enlightenment would have it, has changed during industrialization. You convincingly point out that humans have become a geological agent. And I think this is really a very, very important and convincing point. So it's not only that that humans have a relation to nature, but they became themselves a geological agent. It is fair to say that one of the outcomes of the Enlightenment was the domination of the nature. And what is more, that the human became a driver of changes within the planetary. You're quoting in the last in the appendix to the book Adorno, when you point out that the project of Enlightenment was to help humans overcome fear. So I would like to summarize in a nutshell. First, the Enlightenment paved the way for a domination of the nature that has ultimately made humans a geological agent. And secondly, the paradoxical outcome of this activity of the geological agent is that it provoked a climate change, which now has become the greatest fear humans have ever had. So now the third step, what is your suggestion? How should we come to terms with that situations? And as Eleonora said, I think, how should we as humans come to terms with that, but also as historians, I would like to add. What is your suggestion? I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, and that would be my question. Of course, your suggestion is that we should decenter history in the sense pointed out that we should include the human and the non-human and the planetary, deep history, deep time. But what does it mean? Does this tie in, or is it in contrast to taking the dialectic of Enlightenment seriously and say, we need to remodel the way the Enlightenment defined the nature-human boundary and opt for an inclusive, decentered understanding of human history. And of course, of a new way of the political. If that is so, I would say maybe there is a missing link. So you say that the humans have become a geological agent, and climate change is the outcome of collective the consequence of collective activity. And of course, this collective activity, because you're drawing on Carl Schmitt, in your take is not an intentional activity, but it's a pluriverse activity. And I'm wondering if you would go for another understanding of collective activity that could somehow overcome the understanding of Schmitt and say, of course, there are multiple individual intentions within a collective, but in the end, a collective can act within a specific direction. And this also become a political agent. Could we then maybe come to terms with the situation we are in? And so I would like to repeat my question. Is the climate of history a maybe hidden clear for intensifying the Enlightenment project? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Angelika. Mathias?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dipeshs, for writing this book and for also explaining how it came about. I think really one of the biggest charms of this book is the history of its making. I think let's make no mistake, you would probably not get it accepted as a PhD thesis because it very much departs from what we tell PhD students how a book should be constructed. So to all PhD students, don't try this one. And I found it particularly fascinating how you tell your own history which is not only your own history. I think many people are having this experience. I had this experience that out of a sudden, within the humanities and social sciences, they are confronted with, well, the natural world and how to make sense of it. And after decades of trying to come to terms with the globe or global society or world society, out of sudden we figure out that nature is not simply an external environment out there, but it's strongly linked to social systems. That being said, you play very strongly on this distinction between the global and the planetary. And although I know this needs to be qualified, until the very end, I could not help to think that this distinction really is a depiction of the distinction between the social and the natural world in many respects. And if that is the case, I wonder whether this distinction really properly expresses this distinction. I think we can all agree that there are, there are systems in the world. There are social systems, there are biological systems, geological ones, and that they are, of course, very strongly interlinked. But that, of course, they have very different systems, histories, different temporalities, and that they are very different in kind. I mean, social systems remain meaning processing systems. Within them, learning, unfortunately, also unlearning is possible. Nature evolves. It doesn't learn or unlearns. It evolves in a kind of natural evolution way. There is no cognitive learning, no cognitive evolution, no social evolution. So if we accept this picture that there are different systems in the world that are interlocked, influencing each other, but are very different. They have their specific system boundaries, and on the basis of which you can tell specific system histories. Then I asked myself, what is this planetary system? I asked myself whether not rather the more proper distinction would be the one between the world and the universe. The world being the phenomenological extension of meaning, a social horizon, and the universe covering everything, basically. So what is the exact delineation of the planetary in this respect? I'm no expert in this. I know there is talk about the Earth system, but how in this distinction between social and natural systems do you locate the planetary? Now, I'm a complete amateur, but even if I think about changing climate and weather and everything, I think even I know that, for example, solar winds, solar eruptions play a large role. Now, the sun is definitely not on the planet, but it certainly is an important part of what one might call a planetary system. That being said, how do we arrive at a meaningful and analytically useful categorization of systems and their histories, the different temporalities that are at play? I mean, in a sense, you hint at the necessity of this with the notion of many Anthropocenes, because what seems rather obvious is that we cannot simply import a geological notion of an epoch into the social sciences and humanities and claim it applies here as well. And if one does take the time to look a bit into what the stratigraphy people actually do in geology, I found it very fascinating on how many timescales they actually operate. That the Anthropocene is an epoch, but there's no change in what they call the period or the era or even the eon. And the epoch itself is then subdivided into stages or ages and so on and so on and so on. So geology has a very rich understanding of interlinked temporalities of different kinds of geological strata and systems. And the question is, how do we arrive at such a complex interlocked classification temporalities and of different histories. And finally, and I guess that would be my question, and I can raise this question because I'm not an historian. What does this mean for historians? What's deep? It's a very direct question. What's deep in history? Where does it start and where does it end? I am vaguely aware that there is such a thing called big history. I inadvertently wandered into a panel at a conference a few years ago that was on big history, and I thought they would be dealing with these things, the planet and the Anthropocene. They were talking about the Milky Way and its history, and they said, well, this is really big, but this seems to be deep. Yeah? And ultimately, of course, however, that also begs the question, what's, if there's anything, what's the delimitation of history as a subject that thus far is primarily centered on humans, or at least the social world? Will we require ultimately a big history in the sense that it merges natural and social histories? And I look forward to discussing these things. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Matthias. And I think, well, these are a lot of things to address for Dipeshs, I guess. So I would say you are free to pick up on anything or to bring together the reflections in any way that that you think is appropriate, and then we can begin the exchange. And on your response, again, Eleonora, Angelika, Matthias, just feel free to jump in, and as if you were sitting around the table now. Thank you.
Yeah, and in my Indian culture, it's all right to interrupt. So feel free to interrupt. What I'll do, instead of answering your questions one by one, I could also do that, but there are some overlaps between the questions. I thought I'd take them as a whole, and if I miss out on specific questions, then please come back and remind me, and I'll deal with it. So I'll start with one of Angelika's questions about the provincializing Europe and this book and the question of the universal. And I think you're right. And when I was writing Provincializing Europe, I did not see myself as anti-universal. I saw myself as somebody who believed in universals, and then talked about the problems of having universals. Recently, I gave a talk in New York, and the environmental philosopher who was introducing me actually saw a continuity between these two books. So I'll quote him because I thought it was a nice way of seeing the continuity. He said that Dipeshs was provincializing Europe previously, and now he's provincializing the human. So I think there is some continuity in my interest now in thinking about humans as a minority form of life, and to explore whether what you might regard as minoritarian forms of thinking, like the way that Deleuze famously wrote about Kafka, producing minor literature, or Hannah Arendt made a distinction between what she called the parvenu Jew, the assimilated Jewish person, and borrowing an Indian word, she called the pariah Jew. And she had this desire of a state of Jewish and Palestinian co-settlement in Israel, in what we now call Israel, which would not be dominated by a majoritarian state. So in human histories, there have been very interesting instances of intellectuals trying to think out of a minority position and not contribute to majoritarian forms of thinking. I'm very interested to know whether one can translate that kind of thinking into talking about histories of life, and what should there be in human beings wanting to relate to the natural world and to other forms of life ethically, and should we be, is this a matter of concern that a minority form of life given its technology and everything, dominates the order of life on the planet. So that, going back to what Mathias was saying, my geologist friends say that if the Anthropocene ends up with a sixth great extinction, they will have to upgrade the name Anthropocene, which is the name of an epoch, to Anthropozoic era. It will have to be called an era. So, I mean, there may not be any geologists around to upgrade it, but but it goes back to the point that Mathias was making. So the question is, you know, what I like, the pandemic has also made it clear. If you look at the kind of knowledge we have of bacteria and viruses, and we have developed, it's usually been developed to manage that world, to manage our relationship with them, either to avoid them or to prevent them from causing infections, which is not always bad for them. And if one group of humans developed this kind of knowledge with respect to another group of humans, we would call it colonial knowledge. In other words, knowledge that you developed in order to dominate another group of humans, we call them dominating knowledges. And there have been literature since the 70s, purely in human history. I'm not talking about microbes and viruses. So it raises the question whether the categories of human history can indeed be extended to this world of microbes. Can we ever be friendly with a microbe that wants to kill us for whatever reasons? So there are interesting questions that I don't have answers to them. I'm only posing this as a question as to ask, are there limits to extending moral categories that come out of the human world to dealing with all kinds of forms of life? Now, you know, people have extended human moral categories to some animals in the cruelty to animal literature, in animal rights literature, but that literature often actually talks about what they call in English a sentience threshold. That doesn't apply to all animals. It applies only to animals that can anticipate the pain they're going to feel and therefore experience fear of the impending act of killing or whatever. So I'm just saying that that while one can talk about provincializing Europe to provincializing humans, and there is a connection, and I myself feel the connection because I'm always drawing on human categories that we use between humans to think about the question of whether there can at all be an ethical relationship to the planet or to the Earth system or to nature. I don't have an answer to it. I'm simply raising it as a question. And often I think, is there a limit to how far this can be done? And I only think it because there are colleagues like Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, Isabel Stengers, Anna Singh, or others, or Jane Bennett, who are not Jane Bennett so much, who are always saying, yes, we can. You know, we can have a parliament of things, right? We can have a politics that involves everybody. And I think the fact that we cannot yet has to be recognized as part of the predicament. And what I was trying to do.
You would say that you are more reluctant to that step, to do that step also. So Latour would go a step further, and yeah, okay.
What I would say of Latour, with great deal of respect, admiration, and even affection, he's a very good friend, and somebody from whom I've learned a lot. But I would still say, as my reservation, I would say that you are telling me where I should be. But I don't know how to get there. That we have not built the transition pathways. We don't know how to get there. And so similarly, the question of this goes back to a point that all of you have raised actually, about what does it mean for history writing, this book. So I should again explain the book began by thinking through the impact that the news of the Anthropocene and climate change had on the fundamental categories with which I thought as a humanist historian. So that's why I go back to Collingwood, and Collingwood goes back to Croce. And Croce learned it from a German economist, whose name I forget now, at a conference in Frankfurt around 1906, when this economist said in a lecture that only humans have history and nature has chronology, because history is about making sense of history. History is about meaning making. So in that Karl Jasper's sense, right, the meaning of history. And nature itself does not make any meaning of itself. And that idea through the end of the 19th century, but through the 20th century, evolved into a separation of the natural world and the human world more and more. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, but by the time my generation was born in post-colonial India, in that era of decolonization, we mainly thought that the problem of human society was the problem of distribution of wealth, problem of inequality, problem of not recognition of rights. And we thought the universal was a weapon in this struggle. We needed the universal, even though we had criticisms of how Europeans applied the universal, right? As Frantz Fanon said at the end of The Wretched of the Earth, that all the ingredients for human emancipation are available in European thought, but Europeans don't know how to use them. So it falls on us, the non-Europeans, to begin from European thought and start afresh. But now I think back and actually reading Frantz Fanon and particularly Sartre's preface to The Wretched of the Earth, alongside some work of Achille Mbembe, the recent work of Achille Mbembe's, makes me feel that while we need the universal, but the limitations of the universal, as distinct from a category that he develops, what he calls being in common. Now, Sartre actually shows rightly that when one human being recognizes another human being as distinct from a dog, and you see this in European contact histories, like Europeans turn up in the land of natives. And who do they ask for directions, for water, for roads? They ask human beings. So clearly there's a recognition at one level of one human and of another human as a human being. And then Sartre says, and that is why you convert only a human being into a slave, not an animal. That actually the basis for slavery or cruelty is a kind of perverse human recognition of another human being as human, which is based on the universality of the species. And Achille actually says it's not universal. We need more ideas about being in common, which is not given as universal, which is something you work on. So I want to raise that as a question, whether universal is enough, whether we need something else besides the universal to work on this project of commonness. Now, whether it's in common with other human beings, whether it's common with other natural entities, it's a different question. But at the same time, I feel that if you want to understand the human predicament today, you cannot do without the sciences. For this reason, that what we call the planetary Earth system, or Earth system, the sciences clearly says that in maintaining the climate in the Holocene conditions, stable conditions in which human civilization can flourish, critical roles are played by parts of the world of which humans have very little direct experience. So the deep oceans, even volcanic eruptions, geological processes that refresh the soil, the permafrost of the polar ice, or the Siberian permafrost, the El Niños and the La Niñas that we now talk about. So sometimes when people say that if only went back to peasant society or indigenous society would solve all the problems. We will not solve all the problems that science is pointing to, because science is actually talking about a system that includes roles played by parts of this planet of which humans have no direct experience. Which then gives rise to this question of, I want to talk a little bit about global and planet, go back to some of Matthias, the question that Matthias raised about what is deep history, what is big history. I mean, these are also things that I began to learn, Matthias. And so the distinction that was made by E.O. Wilson, Edward Wilson, the Harvard biologist, was really between what he called, talking about this planet, Earth, between deep history of human beings and recorded history of human beings. And I realized that most historians work with recorded histories, and then archaeologists work with some other kind of evidence. And then, of course, there are historians who, like evolutionary historians of the human species, for instance, or of hominins. So how the genus evolved, how the genus Homo evolved. So when you see human beings as part of the history of evolutionary history of life, so Wilson would call that deep history. And in some ways, I realized in working on this book that deep history is always with us, and whether we think about it or not. So I'll give you two simple facts. One is that we have opposable thumbs. This is work of evolution. This design it's taken millions of years to produce this design. Hands like this, or binocular vision. And now, whether you make a glass, a tumbler, or whether you make a fighter plane, you assume this. You assume that humans have opposable thumbs and humans have binocular vision. So deep history is always around us. And I was telling you before in our own conversation how I've been learning from some of the responses to the book. And a student of mine, a Tamil person, his name is Arvind Elangovan, who is now a historian in America. Reading the book, he wrote to me, he said very interesting, he said, when my mother was alive, every letter his mother wrote to him in Tamil would always begin by saying, "I'm fine, I have no illness. And I hope you don't have any illness either." And that was the first line. And then she'd talk about family drama, uncle so-and-so's story or auntie so-and-so's story. She'd get into human part of life. But it was like, if I translated it in my terms, it was like saying, you and I are swimming in a sea of microbes. None of these microbes have been bad to me yet. I'm fine, I'm not infected. And I hope you're swimming well too. So it made me realize that the deep history normally is part of what in English we refer to as the fatigue element in conversation. So the fatigue element in conversation is the conversation you have before you have a conversation. So I ask you, how are you? Without requiring a big answer. You say good. Or we meet each other and say, isn't this a lovely day? And you are actually admiring the work of the sun, the clouds, the trees, maybe the flowers. And you are actually admiring the planetary. So I realized that the planetary is both acknowledged every day and kind of set at a distance. And where it happens in language is in what in English we call the fatigue part of the conversation. And this comes back to what I was trying to explain before. There are, of course, many systems, as Mathias was saying, but interestingly, Earth system science, one of the most interesting things is that when NASA set up its first subcommittee on Earth system science, they chose to use the word system in singular, not plural. I mean, so the claim, and I can't verify it, I'm not a scientist, but the claim surely is that all these different systems or subsystems interlock. I mean, I don't know if they're reading Luhmann or somebody else, but clearly there's a sense that all these subsystems interlock to create a system-like thing. And in some ways, my planet was a rendering, was a translation of Earth system, taken as a singular. But the reason why I think, or I came to that category planet as distinct from global, was because when I was reading these scientists, I realized, like every scientist, they were both scientists and human beings. And they were not only studying Earth systems, they were writing books for laypersons like me, because they were writing to warn human beings. The scientists had become like prophets. You know, somebody like James Hansen, the US scientist who went to the US Congress and told them about global warming in 1988, was acting like a prophet. He was warning humanity, right? Which is what prophets are meant to do. Prophets are meant to issue warnings. So they themselves had emotional reactions to what they constructed as Earth system. So Earth system, first of all, is a construction. It comes out of big data, satellite measurements, computer models, sea level measurements. It doesn't exist. You don't bump into it. But even having constructed something called the Earth system, scientists would then write about concerns saying, so will human civilization survive? Are we doing the right things? So they were speaking as non-scientists. And the more these books percolate, come into news cycles, what I realized was that the Earth system, which was once a category for specialists, was now emerging as what Latour calls a matter of concern, something that we all can start to worry about. And it is at that point that, for me, it becomes a humanist category. So, and here I go back to Koselleck. Since I'm speaking to you all in Bielefeld, might as well mention the guru. It is really what constructs your horizon of experience. The anxieties that make you ask questions like, can a high-tech civilization survive? Will this civilization survive? Can we forecast the future from our experience? Space of experience. Like if you're Steve Pinker, you will say that experience shows that we are going to have a beautiful future. Don't worry, technology will solve all problems. Whereas the scientists were saying, but is it necessary that a high-tech civilization will kill itself in the end? Is that the logic of it? Now, I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but I'm saying the moment Earth system becomes a subject of worry, the moment I attach my affect to that construction, a scientific construction, that is the moment when it enters my humanist realm of thinking.
So that would mean when you bump into it, right?
Conceptually, when you bump into it. Yeah, conceptually. So you create the system and then you think, oh dear, if this is how it works, are we safe?
And this is where I would ask again, like, having had this situation, we can't ignore this. We can't unthink it. We can't sort of say, oh, well, that's scientists, Earth system scientists should be doing this, and we are just going to blank it out, right?
So this is, yeah, so you see so it come back to what does it mean for history, and what did it mean for me, for this book. So, as I was thinking about this problem, and I say this in the book with reference to Kant's statement in the Introduction to Logic, I realized that I'm not a scientist. I cannot write about this crisis in terms of what do we need to know. I mean, what I'm knowing by reading scientists. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I'm not a policymaker. There are more clever people who can tell you what to do. And they will disagree, which goes back to the pluriverse. I mean, they will disagree. But there are many people, from degrowth activists saying degrow, to technologists saying technology will solve the problem, let's have geoengineering. I'm none of those. I'm not, as Kant says, I'm not an artist or a theologian to say what to expect at the level of your emotions, at the level of your aesthetics, how to think about it. I realized that what I was observing was a change in what Hannah Arendt called the human condition. And the change is this, that when Hannah Arendt wrote The Human Condition in 1958, I think, the Russian Sputnik had just gone up. And Arendt looked at that optimistically. Ironically too, because she said, look, human beings have now ensured the survival of the species. When this planet doesn't work, we'll go somewhere else, but we will pay a price for it. Because we are earthlings, we are of this earth. And the price will be what she called in English, earth alienation. But I realized that the 21st century was not the moment when the Sputnik went up. And there had been a shift in the human condition where we're actually worried about our increased technological capability. We are worried that if we do geoengineering, there might be more wars, there might be more conflict, the sky might be white permanently. We are worried that if technology remains unbridled, the future of human labor may be threatened. We are worried about that if capitalism proceeds in this extractive neoliberal fashion, the poor might have to bear the brunt of climate change, which has been brought about by our flourishing and technological expansion. So in a way, we are actually worried about our technological capacity that also allows us to enable 8 billion human beings to survive the technosphere. And so what I was trying to do, more than trying to answer the question, what should therefore historians do? I was trying to use my training as a historian to think more deeply into the predicament that humans are in. So I was trying to write in my head. I'm a much smaller person, smaller intellectual than Hannah Arendt, but in my head, I was always asking myself, how would she update the book? If I could have a conversation with Hannah Arendt, I was having imaginary conversation with Hannah Arendt, and particularly saying, would you write the same thing about the Russian Sputnik today that you wrote in 1958? Would it give you the same kind of optimism? And today, I would be fairly sort of confident to say that the optimism is far more qualified. That even if you spoke to geoengineering, they might champion the project, but they would see the objections to it. So in a way, what the book tries to do is to, first of all, it tries to understand the predicament in as much depth as I could plumb. And that's where I thought that even if we disagree, even if in Carl Schmitt's terms, there's a pluriverse, and humans will never come under the umbrella of one rational argument, even if there's disagreement. And disagreement is also the ground for democracy. I mean, disagreement as such is not a bad thing. But whether we can think ourselves as being in common, I mean, whether we can all accept the point that our lives are entangled with other forms of life, even if you can't create politics out of it. Whether we can accept the fact that the pandemic has both a global and planetary aspect to it. And
that is also where maybe the idea of collective action ties in, because I would contradict to Schmitt. I think for a collective action, you would not have to have a shared rationale also, because you can have many different reasons why you would do something. So maybe someone is afraid of the climate change and another person just doesn't like hot weather, or so it might be different, but still they would maybe come to the point where they have a common action and common idea of a specific action. And I think that would be a direction to to think further and go further.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. But again, it goes back to what Matthias was saying. The question of temporality here is so complicated because IPCC is always giving you a calendar for synchronized action.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Whereas what you're talking about, yeah, it's not happening. So
Yeah,
that's why I thought.
Yeah.
That's why I thought, can I read Jasper on what he called epochal consciousness?
Yeah.
Which he described as a pre-political form of thinking, which is not what he called departmental, which does not divide up the world into political science and history and this and that. And therefore, that's why I go back to Jasper's in the last chapter to refer to epochal, and that is kind of that is sort of approaching your question about, and also Achille Mbembe's point about being in common. And so I was trying to plumb the depth of the predicament and see if you could at least agree on the depth of the predicament, even if we disagreed on what to do about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I find that very convincing, and I'm feeling as well. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad that you found it convincing.
Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, what should we do? There's no other idea what we could do.
But going back to the question, what does it mean for history, which I'm interested in as a historian? And here I want to say and Eleonora knows this better than I do. Historians have already produced many different responses to the problem. One is, of course, the climate history group that Franz and others were part of, that I was once invited to, and that there's been a tradition of actually even working out the history of the climate of the planet, the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, from shipping records and other things, which is very, very helpful. Historians are extremely useful in informing scientists about the role of categories that we can explain, like capitalism, like the role of the United Nations, the question of institutional deficit. I mean, the United Nations was a response to the world as it existed after the Second World War. And we can ask a question, is there an institutional deficit in today's world? Do we need forms of global governance in particular areas? I'll just give you one example from my part of the world. So there was an environmental activist in India, Sundarlal Bahuguna, who was the leader of the Chipko movement that you may have heard about, the tree hugging movement that happened in India. He died recently. And he said once a very beautiful thing. He said, Indians think that the product of the Himalayas are apples and other fruits they can sell. He said the product of the mountains, called the Himalayas, is water. It's the 8 or 9 rivers that come out of that mountain and serve countries from Pakistan to Vietnam. And many of these are snow-fed rivers. Some are underground water-fed. But India, China, Pakistan, all the Vietnam, they all consider rivers to be national property. There's no multilateral agency to look after the health of the glaciers. So these are questions that we can raise, whether there is an institutional deficit in the world, right? So the historians have a role to play. Also, the other thing that my colleague Frederick Johnson has done, he's working on one book on the history of the idea of scarcity. So he's been working on the idea of cornucopia that sometimes drives capitalism, and the idea of scarcity. But he also, with his wife, he wrote a book on Victoria Albertson, who wrote a book on Ruskin as an exemplar person. And many people are actually, some of my Indian friends are returning to Gandhi to see whether in the conceptions of these people there are ideas, or to the Romantics, whether or some are going to indigenous societies or peasant societies, to see whether there are other principles about ways of living, ways of being. And even Heidegger is useful when in some of his writings there, for all my criticism.
Yes.
Which we can bring to the desk. Yeah. Zoltán.
Yes. If you don't mind, because now we are running or starting to run out of time, then I think probably it would be we can just start to open the floor to questions. And very many thanks for all of you for this, very stimulating discussions of incredible complexities that we navigate. And then I think most likely, even if we will proceed with the questions, as I feel in many Anthropocene debates, the point will not be that we are going to have answers here. Actually, we are opening discussions on stuff to coping with or trying to understand certain things. So I would just ask the question, if anyone has a question, then please raise your hand. And until the first hand's raised, I would just also like to point out one of these complexities that that derives from the way that Dipeshs phrased or asked the question that, is this a concern that a minority life dominates planetary life? And I think this question just perfectly exemplifies the complexity, because whatever you answer, you are anthropocentric. And then the question is that in what way you will be anthropocentric rather than, is it possible to be humans or planet-centered in the first place? Because let's go with this question. If you say no, that if you say that it's not a concern that a minority life dominates planetary life, then of course you are just openly anthropocentric by conceding that whatever you do, as a human in this world, then that should be just all other life forms should be, come to terms with it. But if you say that that yes, it is a concern, then you're going to be anthropocentric to the extent that, because then you think that a specifically human concern has to be a concern of all other forms of life and of the planet. And that's, again, I think it's, of course, it's an intraspecies concern extended over being a planetary concern. So I don't think there is a way to answer this question phrased in this way that you phrased, which is somehow not anthropocentric in one way or another. And I think this is, again, just one of the tremendous complexities that that we sort of struggling to comprehend.